In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche published a short parable. A madman runs into a marketplace carrying a lantern in the middle of the day. He is looking for God. The crowd laughs at him, and the madman stops and says, "We have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But do you understand what this means? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where are we moving now? Are we not plunging backward, sideward, forward, in all directions?"
The crowd keeps laughing. They do not understand what the madman is saying. And he throws down his lantern and says, "I have come too early. This tremendous event is still on its way."
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Shawn.
And I'm Claire. Nietzsche is probably the most misread philosopher in the Western canon. He has been claimed by Nazis, by nihilists, by self-help gurus, by heavy metal musicians, and by a dizzying variety of people who have read a sentence or two and decided they understood the argument. Today we are going to try to read him honestly, to understand what the death of God actually means in his framework, what it implies for values and meaning and the structure of modern life, and why his questions are still the most urgent ones that Western civilization has not yet answered. Big ideas, human conversations, let's go. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the Prussian province of Saxony, into a family with a long line of Lutheran ministers. His father died when Nietzsche was 4, and he was raised in a household of women, his mother, sister, grandmother, and 2 aunts, an upbringing whose effects on his psychology and his philosophy scholars have been debating ever since.
He was a brilliant student. By 24, he was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland, without even having completed his doctorate. His first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, was an interpretation of Greek culture organized around the tension between the Apollonian, the ordered, rational, form-giving impulse, and the Dionysian, the chaotic, ecstatic, life-affirming impulse. It was not well received by professional classicists, who found it too speculative, but it announced a major philosophical voice.
He had a long and deeply complicated friendship with Richard Wagner, the composer, whom he initially idolized and later came to see as representative of everything he found wrong with German culture, the nationalism, the anti-Semitism, the theatrical grandiosity, the flight from genuine thought into sentiment and spectacle. The break with Wagner was painful and productive. Some of Nietzsche's most searching criticism of the culture of his time is aimed, obliquely or directly, at what he saw as the Wagnerian temptation.
His health was catastrophic throughout his adult life. He suffered from severe migraines, vision problems, and digestive ailments that made sustained work almost impossible, and that drove him from city to city in search of climates that would ease his symptoms. He was a philosopher almost entirely without a stable home. He stayed in rented rooms in Switzerland, Italy, and France, writing in intense, productive bursts between periods of incapacitation.
In January of 1889, in Turin, he collapsed in the street. He never recovered his sanity. The final 11 years of his life were spent in a state of mental incapacity, first in an asylum, then in the care of his mother, and later his sister Elizabeth. It was during this period that his sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, took control of his unpublished manuscripts and archives and began the systematic distortion of his work that would eventually associate his name with National Socialism, a grotesque misreading that the actual texts do not support, and that Nietzsche himself, in his lucid years, would have found horrifying. He was a fierce critic of German nationalism and of anti-Semitism throughout his career.
His major works, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morality, The Gay Science, Twilight of the Idols, were written in the 1880s, a period of extraordinary productivity squeezed between illness and breakdown. They are among the most stylistically distinctive texts in the philosophical tradition. Aphoristic, poetic, deliberately provocative, written to disturb rather than to systematize. Reading Nietzsche requires a different kind of attention than reading Kant or Aristotle. He is not building an argument that unfolds step by step. He is throwing things at you and watching what you do with them. The question of what Nietzsche actually believed is genuinely difficult to answer, partly because of the style and partly because of the Elizabeth problem. His sister spent decades after his breakdown editing, combining, and selectively publishing his unpublished notes in ways that distorted the record most notoriously by assembling a collection called The Will to Power from fragments that Nietzsche had discarded and presenting it as his masterwork. The resulting text bears little relationship to what Nietzsche himself authorized and the readings that relied on it, including many of the Nazi appropriations, were reading a partly fabricated version of the philosopher.
The scholarly work of Walter Kaufmann, beginning in the late 1940s, was central to recovering Nietzsche's actual texts and thought from the distortions. Kaufmann's translations and his philosophical biography remain essential starting points. The picture that emerges from the actual authorized texts is of a thinker who was deeply opposed to nationalism, contemptuous of anti-Semitism, hostile to German culture in its Wagnerian form, and fundamentally concerned not with the domination of others, but with the question of self-overcoming and the creation of genuine value. That is not the Nietzsche of the popular imagination. It is the one worth taking seriously. The phrase, "God is dead," is the most famous and most misunderstood sentence in Nietzsche's work. It is almost never what people think it is. So let us be precise about what Nietzsche is actually claiming.
He is not making an argument for atheism. He is not celebrating the fact that God does not exist. He is describing a cultural and historical event, something that has already happened to Western civilization, whether it knows it or not. The Christian God, the metaphysical foundation that gave Western culture its framework of meaning, its account of objective value, its story of human purpose, that foundation has collapsed. Not because an argument was made that defeated it, though arguments were made, but because the broader intellectual culture, the rise of science, the development of historical consciousness, the general trajectory of Enlightenment rationalism has made it impossible for educated people to believe in the way that was once possible.
The madman with the lantern is not an atheist triumphant. He is a man in grief. He is describing not a victory but a catastrophe, because the God whose death he is announcing was not just a theological proposition. It was the source of the entire structure of Western values, the foundation of the claim that human life has meaning, that there is a difference between good and evil, that suffering has a point, that history is going somewhere. When the foundation collapses, everything built on it is endangered, and most people in the marketplace have not yet understood that.
Nietzsche's diagnosis of his own era is that it is living in a kind of transitional fog, that the old foundations have collapsed, but the implications have not yet been absorbed. People continue to hold values, to make moral judgments, to talk about human dignity and progress and goodness, as if the metaphysical framework that gave those concepts their meaning were still intact. They are, in his phrase, living on the shadows of God, using the vocabulary and the habits of a worldview whose foundations they have abandoned, without noticing the contradiction.
The crisis this creates is what he calls nihilism, not the cheerful nihilism of the person who says, nothing matters, so let's party, but the deep, structural nihilism of a civilization that has lost its foundation and does not know how to build a new one. The danger Nietzsche sees is not that people will consciously embrace meaninglessness. It is that they will unconsciously drift into a kind of passive resignation, what he calls the last man, a comfortable, unambitious, historically flattened existence in which nothing is demanded and nothing is achieved, because nothing is believed in deeply enough to be worth demanding or achieving.
And his question, the question that organizes everything else in his philosophy is, given that the old foundation is gone, what do we build on? How do we create values that are genuinely ours, grounded not in a divine command or a metaphysical order, but in the affirmation of life itself? That is the project. And it is one of the most ambitious philosophical projects of the last 2 centuries. It is worth being precise about what Nietzsche means by nihilism, because the word gets used loosely. Nihilism in his framework is not simply atheism or moral skepticism. It is the specific condition of a civilization that has lost its values without yet having found new ones. The condition of meaninglessness that follows the collapse of the foundation. And Nietzsche thought it was the defining danger of the modern age. Not the danger that people would consciously declare that nothing matters, but the danger that they would unconsciously act as if nothing does, pursuing comfort and security and the avoidance of suffering, rather than anything that genuinely demands effort and sacrifice and courage.
The last man is one of Nietzsche's most devastating images. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra descends from his mountain to teach the Übermensch and instead encounters the crowd's enthusiastic embrace of its opposite. The last man is small, comfortable, clever in a petty way, easily satisfied. He has invented happiness. He blinks. Everything that demands greatness, the willingness to suffer for something, to risk something, to commit to something larger than personal comfort, the last man has made impossible by making comfort the supreme value. He is, in Nietzsche's view, what Western civilization is in danger of becoming, a species that has bred out its own capacity for the heroic.
The reading that I think is most honest locates Nietzsche not as a prophet of strength and domination, that is Elizabeth's reading, the Nazi reading, the misreading, but as a diagnostician of a specific spiritual crisis that is genuinely ours. The Last Man is not a caricature of weakness. He is a recognizable portrait of a certain kind of modern life, organized around optimization, risk avoidance, and the management of experience, rather than its full embrace. And the question Nietzsche is pressing is not whether we admire the last man, but whether we want to be him.
One of Nietzsche's most original and most controversial contributions is his genealogy of morality, his account of where our values actually came from. And the account he gives is deeply uncomfortable for most people who encounter it seriously.
His argument, developed most fully in On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, is that the dominant moral framework of the Western world, the moral system organized around humility, compassion, self-denial, equality, the value of the weak and the suffering, did not arise from a disinterested perception of moral truth. It arose from a specific historical and psychological configuration, the resentment of the powerless toward the powerful.
He distinguishes between what he calls master morality and slave morality. Master morality, which he associates with the aristocratic cultures of ancient Greece and Rome, starts from a basic affirmation: I am good. I am strong, vital, creative, life-affirming. The noble person defines themselves positively in terms of what they are, and regards weakness and passivity and self-denial as simply bad, not evil, just lesser, not what a flourishing person would be.
Slave morality starts from a negation. It begins not with a positive self-affirmation, but with a reaction to the master. You are evil. The slave cannot overcome the master directly. But through a psychological transformation that Nietzsche calls the slave revolt in morality, the values get inverted. Strength becomes arrogance. Vitality becomes selfishness. The worldly success of the powerful becomes evidence of their moral corruption. And the qualities of the powerless, humility, meekness, suffering, self-denial, become virtues. The weak become the good, and the powerful become the evil.
He locates this inversion historically in the rise of Judaism and then Christianity, the triumph of what he calls priestly values over noble values. And he is unsparing in his analysis. The love of neighbor, the meekness of the blessed poor, the equation of suffering with spiritual depth, these are not, in his account, evidence of a genuine moral advance. They are revenge of the weak against the strong, dressed up in the language of universal moral truth.
This is where Nietzsche becomes most dangerous to misread. He is not saying that the strong should oppress the weak. He is not celebrating cruelty. He is making a genealogical argument, an argument about origins that is supposed to make us suspicious of the moral framework we have inherited. Not to discard it wholesale, but to ask, are these values genuinely life-affirming? Do they serve human flourishing? Or are they the crystallized resentment of a historical configuration that has since been forgotten?
The project he is calling for is what he names the revaluation of all values, not the abandonment of values, but their radical rethinking from the ground up. Not, what values did we inherit, but what values would we choose if we were genuinely committed to life and to human excellence? That is a genuinely demanding question, and Nietzsche did not fully answer it. But asking it clearly is itself a philosophical achievement.
I want to be clear that the genealogical argument does not logically entail that the values it traces are false or should be abandoned. The genetic fallacy is a real fallacy. The origin of a belief does not determine its truth value. Values that arose from resentment could still be genuinely good values. And Nietzsche sometimes obscures this. His rhetorical force is in the exposure, and he is not always careful to distinguish showing that a value has a particular history from showing that the value is wrong.
But what the genealogical argument does accomplish, and this is its genuine contribution, is to break the spell of moral inevitability. When you understand that the values you hold have a history, that they could have been otherwise, that they reflect specific configurations of power and psychology rather than eternal moral facts, you are in a position to ask which of them you actually endorse on reflection and which you have simply inherited without examination. That is not nihilism. That is the examined life applied to the domain of values, exactly the kind of Socratic questioning that this show keeps returning to as the core philosophical practice.
There are three concepts in Nietzsche's work that are the most famous and the most consistently misread: the Übermensch, the will to power, and the eternal recurrence. I want to try to give each of them an honest treatment because the popular versions are almost completely wrong.
The Übermensch, often translated as Superman or Overman, is not a racial category. It is not a description of Aryan superiority. It is a philosophical ideal, the image of what a human being would look like if they had genuinely accomplished the revaluation of values, if they had created their own values rather than inheriting them, if they had overcome the nihilism and the last man temptation, if they had said yes to life in its full complexity, rather than retreating into comfort or resentment. The Übermensch is less a person than a possibility, a horizon toward which genuine self-overcoming points.
Nietzsche's Zarathustra says that the human being is something that shall be overcome, that we are a rope stretched between the animal and the Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. What he means is that the current form of human being, organized around inherited values and reactive psychology and the herd instinct, is not the final word. There is something beyond it. And the task of genuine philosophy and genuine culture is to point toward it, not to make everyone comfortable in the mediocrity of what already exists.
The will to power is even more consistently misread than the Übermensch. It is almost universally taken to mean the desire to dominate others, the will to political or military power. But that is not what Nietzsche means. The will to power, in his framework, is the fundamental drive of all living things, not toward domination of others, but toward self-overcoming, toward growth, toward the expansion of one's own capacities and the expression of one's own nature. A plant exercises will to power by growing toward the light. An artist exercises will to power by creating something that did not exist before. A philosopher exercises will to power by thinking thoughts that challenge and expand the limits of what can be thought.
The problem with the reactive psychology Nietzsche is criticizing, the resentment, the self-denial, the slave morality, is precisely that it is a distorted, inverted form of will to power. The powerless person who cannot affirm themselves directly turns their energy toward pulling down what is strong. The will to power that cannot go upward goes sideways into destruction. The revaluation of values is in part a project of redirecting that energy, of turning the will to power back toward genuine self-overcoming rather than reactive revenge.
The eternal recurrence is the most philosophically interesting of the three, and the one that has generated the most interpretive controversy. The basic idea is this: what if your life, every moment of it, every joy, and every suffering, were to recur an infinite number of times exactly as it has already happened? The same pleasures, the same failures, the same losses, repeating forever without any end or improvement. Could you affirm that? Could you say yes to your life on those terms?
It is almost certainly not meant as a cosmological claim. Nietzsche probably did not literally believe that time is cyclical in this way. It is a thought experiment, a psychological test. The person who can say yes to their life, even under the hypothesis of eternal recurrence, who would not wish a single moment different if they knew it would repeat infinitely, has achieved the fullest possible affirmation of existence. The eternal recurrence is the ultimate expression of amor fati, the love of fate, the willingness to embrace your life, not despite its difficulties, but with them in their full weight and completeness.
I want to do what we always try to do, be honest about both what is genuinely insightful and what is genuinely problematic in Nietzsche's work. Because he is a thinker who demands both serious engagement and serious criticism.
What he genuinely got right, in my view, is the diagnosis. The observation that Western civilization is living on borrowed foundations, that it continues to use the vocabulary of value and meaning while having abandoned the metaphysical framework that once grounded that vocabulary, is not only historically accurate, but more relevant now than when he wrote it. The secular world has not solved the problem of meaning. It has largely inherited it without acknowledging it. The existential vacuum that Frankl identified, the meaninglessness and emptiness that drives depression, addiction, and political susceptibility, is exactly what Nietzsche was predicting.
The genealogical method is also a genuine contribution. The insight that our values have a history, that they did not emerge from pure moral perception, but from specific power configurations, specific psychological dynamics, specific historical moments, is one of the most important methodological tools in the humanities and social sciences. Foucault extended it. The whole field of the social history of ideas draws on it. The willingness to ask where a value came from, rather than simply whether it is true, has opened up intellectual territory that would not otherwise have been available.
And amor fati, the love of fate, is one of the most genuinely useful philosophical orientations I know. Not acceptance in the passive, resigned sense, but the active affirmation of your life as it is, the willingness to say yes to the specific circumstances, the specific losses, the specific history that has made you who you are, rather than spending your energy wishing things had been different. This connects to what Frankl said about the attitude toward unavoidable suffering. It connects to the Stoic practice of distinguishing what is up to you from what is not. It is a very old insight that Nietzsche renders in a new and sharper form.
What is genuinely problematic in Nietzsche is harder to dismiss. His contempt for the herd, for the average, for democratic equality, his insistence that culture is always the product of exceptional individuals and that the many exist to serve the conditions for the few, sits very uncomfortably with any serious commitment to human dignity and political equality. He is not a fascist. But his framework provides genuine resources for fascist appropriation that go beyond what Elizabeth did with the archives. The celebration of strength, the contempt for weakness, the hierarchical picture of human value, these are not innocent, and they have consequences that Nietzsche did not adequately reckon with.
There is also the question of whether his positive vision, the Übermensch, the revaluation of values, the creation of new meaning, is actually achieved or merely gestured at. He is magnificent in destruction. He is brilliant at diagnosing what is wrong with inherited values and inherited frameworks. He is considerably less clear about what comes after. The Übermensch remains a horizon, not a blueprint. And in the absence of a blueprint, the danger is that people fill in the picture with whatever they happen to want, which is precisely how Nietzsche became so thoroughly available to misreading.
The philosopher Alexander Nahamas, in a book called Nietzsche, Life as Literature, offers what I think is the most defensible reading of the positive vision. He argues that the Übermensch and the eternal recurrence are best understood not as metaphysical claims, but as aesthetic ones, as descriptions of what a fully integrated, self-created human life would look like. The person who could affirm eternal recurrence is someone who has made their life into a coherent whole, who has found a way to say yes to who they are and what they have done without denial or resentment. That is an aesthetic ideal rather than a moral one. It is about the beauty and integrity of a life rather than about following rules. And as an aesthetic ideal, it is considerably more defensible than the political misreadings. What I find most useful in Nietzsche and most honest to say plainly is the discomfort he produces. He is not a comfortable philosopher. Reading him seriously means being confronted with questions about your own values that you would rather not face. Whether they are genuinely yours or merely inherited, whether they serve life or diminish it, whether the way you are living is an affirmation or a refusal. Those questions are not settled by finding them uncomfortable. They are the questions that the examined life keeps returning to, whether Nietzsche is the occasion for asking them or someone else's.
I want to say something about why Nietzsche matters to this show in particular. We have been working through a set of thinkers who are all, in different ways, trying to answer the question of what grounds a good life. Marcus Aurelius grounds it in virtue in the rational order of nature. Aristotle grounds it in the full exercise of human capacities in community. Frankl grounds it in the discovery of meaning even in extremity. James grounds it in the committed, risk-taking, forward-leaning orientation of the will to believe.
Nietzsche does something different from all of them. He does not offer a foundation. He removes the last remaining one and then asks, now what? He is the philosopher of the condition we are actually in, the condition in which the traditional answers are no longer available and the new ones have not yet been fully constructed. And that makes him, for better and worse, the most contemporary of the major thinkers we have covered.
His answer that we must become the creators of our own values, that we must say yes to life without any external guarantee, that the yes is warranted, that the task of the serious person is not to inherit a meaning, but to make one is both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because it is a genuine call to philosophical seriousness, to taking responsibility for the values you live by, rather than simply inheriting them. Terrifying because it offers no safety net. The freedom he is describing is Sartrean in its completeness and its demand.
What I keep coming back to is the madman in the marketplace. He is not triumphant, he is not celebrating, he is horrified by what he has seen, by the fact that the foundation has collapsed and nobody has noticed. And he says, I have come too early. This tremendous event is still on its way. That phrase, still on its way, suggests that the full implications of the death of God have not yet been absorbed. And I think that is still true. We are still, in important ways, living in the transitional fog Nietzsche described. We have not yet figured out how to build what he thought needed to be built.
One thing that strikes me, looking at all the thinkers we have covered, is how many of them were responding to the same underlying problem from different directions. Frankl's existential vacuum. Aristotle's worry about the person who pursues pleasure alone. Arendt's analysis of the atomized individual, susceptible, to totalitarian ideology, James's crisis of meaning in the face of scientific materialism. They are all at some level describing the same condition that Nietzsche diagnosed most starkly, the condition of a civilization that has lost its foundations and is trying to navigate without a map. And the philosophical tradition is, in large part, the accumulation of attempts to draw that map. Some more successful than others, none of them final.
Nietzsche's contribution to that tradition is not a new map. It is the clearest possible description of why the old one no longer works and the most demanding articulation of what drawing a new one would require. Not inherited values, not comfortable mediocrity, not the avoidance of suffering, but genuine self-overcoming, genuine creation, genuine affirmation of life in its full complexity. Whether any of us achieve that is another question. But knowing that it is what is being asked, that is itself something worth knowing.
Amor fati, love of fate, is the concept I find myself returning to most from this episode. Not as a license for passivity or a reason to stop trying to change what can be changed, but as an orientation toward what cannot be changed. The losses that cannot be undone, the circumstances that cannot be reversed, the specific life that is yours rather than the one you might have preferred. Nietzsche is asking, can you love that? Not accept it with resignation, not tolerate it with gritted teeth, but genuinely say yes to the full texture of what your life has been and is. That question does not get easier for having been asked. But it is the right question, and the willingness to sit with it, to let it be hard, is itself a form of the self-overcoming Nietzsche was pointing toward.
Philosophy for Lunch is a show that keeps returning to hard questions without pretending they are easy. Nietzsche is perhaps the hardest we have done, not because the ideas are technically difficult, but because they ask something of you personally that most philosophical frameworks do not. They ask whether you are willing to examine your values without the safety net of claiming they are simply given. Whether you can face the absence of external guarantees and still commit, that is not a comfortable ask. But discomfort, as we have been saying throughout this show, is where the real examination begins.
Next week, the paradox of tolerance. Karl Popper's argument from 1945 that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance, that a free society that tolerates intolerance will eventually be destroyed by it. One of the most relevant and most misunderstood philosophical arguments of the 20th century, and one that connects directly to everything Nietzsche raises about what happens when civilizations lose their foundations.
If this episode made Nietzsche feel more urgent and less cartoonish, share it with someone who has been misled by the popular version. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.